Welcome back to my series on phenomenology and Sufism. These short talks are meant to accompany the podcast I'm creating with my friend and colleague Adnan Hussein, who is a historian of medieval religion. In these talks, I'm speaking both as a phenomenologist and as someone with 3 decades of practice within a Sufi tradition. As somebody doing phenomenology, I set aside any beliefs or doctrines I'm attached to in order to investigate lived experiences as they show themselves. So today, whenever I use words like God in this recording, realize I'm leaving open the many meanings that word may have for those of you listening. Adnan and I don't assume that you belong to any particular religious tradition.
My aim is that what we can offer be meaningful for anyone, whether or not they're connected to a specific religious or meditative path or not. At this point in the series, I'm speaking a lot about Islamic mysticism, but also generally about the Abrahamic faiths within which the relationship between God and human is of central importance. So today, I want to make the claim that as humans, the way we envision our relationship with God or the divine or the real, however we name it, how we envision this relationship not only frames what that relationship means for us in the here and now, but in a certain way also projects forward and limits what that relationship can be for us in the future. Why? How can our way of envisioning our relationship with God shape and limit what's possible? I'll give you a human example. Let's say I have a friend, and the way I think about my friendship with him is, okay, well, if something catastrophically bad happened in my life, if I get hit by a car, I know I could call on him for help. But I also imagine he doesn't really want to hear about my actual daily life and my ups and downs. Okay, so if that's what I expect from him, then naturally I'm going to limit how much of my life I share with him. In other words, I'm going to edit what I share. So due to my expectations, I'm placing a limit on the friendship. Sure, if I did open up, my expectations might be confirmed. Maybe he's just not that interested, right? Or I might be surprised that he was actually way more available as a friend than I thought. But if I don't allow for that possibility, then I'm not giving him the option to show up more fully as a friend, as my friend. Okay, now you might say, hey, I thought this was about God. Your example is about relating to a person. Isn't this obviously anthropomorphic? But consider that one of the names of God in the Islamic tradition that Adnan and I are going to be talking about is Al-Wali, the protective friend or the guarding friend, right? And in Farsi or in Ottoman Turkish or in Urdu, God can also be referred to as Dost, the intimate friend, Dost. So consider that the tradition we'll be talking about invites the example of friendship. My point is that the way we envision our relationship with God is what we can call a pre-interpretation of the meaning of the relationship. Why? Because the way we imagine God shapes our expectations in important ways. Those expectations are informed by our personal ideas, by the family and tradition we're raised in, maybe the religious or meditative path we've taken on. All of these lead to expectations that most of us don't question in the course of daily life. We just take them for granted. So those assumptions, those pre-interpretations we carry around, usually without even being aware of them. And my argument is that the way you envision your relationship with God will, to a very great extent, set the stage for what you're likely to encounter, at least initially, in prayer, in meditation, etc. Because all of these expectations shape your image of God. So they shape what you're looking for and expecting to find or not to find. They shape your God image. And by the way, Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi in the 14th century described a similar phenomenon in his book, Fusus al-Hikam. What Ibn al-Arabi calls the God of belief, Ilal Muqtaqad, God of belief, is the divinity that the worshipper forms within themselves as they imagine or expect God to be. And Ibn al-Arabi points out that the God of belief is not equivalent to or capable of embracing the divine in itself, in its totality. Though, nevertheless, for Ibn Arabi, the way we imagine God to be is the means for genuine worship. So I'm not just speaking from modern phenomenology and hermeneutics, I'm also speaking in contact with the Akbari tradition itself. However, and this is important, I'm not claiming that one's beliefs or expectations determine the totality of what you can experience. That position would be what academics call a strong constructivist perspective, which is not the position I'm taking. So in contrast, my understanding of phenomenology and hermeneutics is that while experiences are given to us and interpreted by us in specific historical and cultural and religious or non-religious contexts, the ways in which experiences are given to us are not reducible to those contexts or purely determined by those contexts. So I'm not what an academic would call a hard constructivist. But like I mentioned earlier, most of us don't even carefully reflect on what our already existing God image is, whether or not the word God is meaningful, right? Because even an avowed atheist has an idea of what God would be for him or her. See? So unless you recognize and at least temporarily bracket and set aside your expectations, then it's likely you're always looking through the lens of your own pre-interpretations. And that's going to limit what's possible in ways that you don't recognize. So having said all this, today I want to outline 3 broadly different ways in which one might envision one's relationship to their transcendent source, whether we name that Allah or the real or being. In the future, I want to broaden this to touch on South and East Asian religious traditions, but for today, I'm going to stay close to the Abrahamic religions. So the 3 different alternatives I'm going to be talking about are what I'll describe as a dualistic view, a non-dual view, and a third or middle position that I'll call qualified non-dualism. These are 3 different ways of envisioning the relationship that a human has to God. With a disclaimer that, of course, you could fill whole libraries with discussions of any one of them. So first, dualism, existential dualism. So roughly speaking, if you have a strongly dualistic conception of your relationship with God, then you conceive of God as absolutely transcendent, distinct, and different from you and from all of creation. When I say dualistic, I mean a particular kind of dualism. Technically, what I mean here is existential dualism, meaning that your existence and God's existence are conceived of as completely different and incomparable. So from this perspective, your relationship with God is a relationship with an absolute other, a God who is envisioned as unimaginably different from us. From this perspective, any suggestion of similarity between God and us would make no sense. It could even be offensive or blasphemous because it would be seen as diminishing the divine majesty and transcendence. So this is my sketch of an existential dualist view. One important caveat. For Christians, Jesus can be understood as bridging this great divide between humanity and divinity. So today, to keep things simple for the time being, I'm setting aside that important aspect of the variety of Christian perspectives. But I suspect and I hope that Adnan and I are going to engage with Christian mysticism later in the series. Okay. Second, non-dualism. Now, on the opposite extreme, if you have a strict non-dual conception of humans' relationship to the divine, then any apparent distinction or separation between you and the source of your being would be considered a misperception of what's in fact always already the case, namely, there's only one existent, whether that's referred to as God or whether it's pure being or non-delimited awareness. For the non-dualist, that's all there is. In other words, you as an entity don't really exist. From a non-dual perspective, you just appear to exist because you're in a condition of obscuration or ignorance about the really real. There isn't actually a real relationship at all because that would imply some kind of genuine multiplicity, which is ruled out as an illusion. Now, many of you might associate this picture with South Asian or East Asian non-dual traditions like Advaita Vedanta or Mahayana Buddhism. But for sure, the non-dual perspective isn't commonly associated with the Abrahamic religions. However, in a minute, I'm going to give you an example of a Muslim non-dualist. So the variety within religious traditions is much greater than is usually appreciated. Okay, so whereas the dualist is concerned with pleasing or serving a God who's envisioned as strictly separate from her or him, and one seeking to align their actions and ethics with what is desired or commanded by that separate God, the non-dual person wants to engage in whatever practices free them from the delusion that they are separate, that they have a separate self and a separate personal identity. They're seeking to awaken from that illusion and grasp their already existing unity with that source. In fact, from a strictly non-dual perspective, it isn't even correct to say their unity with the source, because there is no they. There's only the one. So whereas the dualist might conceive of their spiritual path as seeking greater and greater fulfillment of a role as a servant in relationship to God, may be a lifelong path of deepening their servanthood, the non-dual person might conceive of their path as a lifelong process of purification during which they function provisionally as a seemingly separate agent, while seeking to shed this illusion and drop their sense of separate selfhood altogether. Now, broadly speaking, the more dualist perspective will be familiar to those who were raised around an Abrahamic tradition, even if they rejected that religion. But take, for example, Al-Had al-Din Balyani. Balyani was a 13th century Sufi from Shiraz. And I'm going to read you a passage in which Balyani is talking about human beings' relationship to God. Balyani is commenting here on a famous statement attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that Adnan and I mentioned already. And that statement is, "Who knows himself knows his Lord. Who knows himself knows his Lord." About this, Balyani says, quote, "What the Prophet pointed out by that is that you are not you, but you are him. And there's no you. It's not that he enters into you, or that you enter into him, or that he comes out of you, or that you come out of him. This does not mean that you have being and that you're qualified by this or that attribute. What's meant is that you never were and never will be, whether through yourself or through him or in him or with him. You have neither ceased to be, nor are you existent." Unquote. Wow. So that's an expression of non-dualism in Islam right there. There is no you, there's only he. Now, to be fair, this is an exceptionally strong non-dual position in Islamic history, as far as I know, not common. Now, in contrast, the stream in Islam and Sufism that I'm most familiar with is that initiated by the 13th century Sufi Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi and his inheritors, who I refer to as Akbaris, since Ibn al-Arabi was called Sheikh al-Akbar. The Akbaris represent a third perspective, different from both strict dualism and strict non-dualism. This third perspective, the scholar William Chittick has called qualified monism, and I like to call it qualified non-dualism. The reason for calling it qualified non-dualism is that the inheritors of Ibn al-Arabi neither claim that your existence is absolutely different and distinct from God's, like the dualists, nor do they claim that you don't exist at all, like the non-dualists. Instead, the Akbaris want to have it both ways, in a sense. The way they envision the human-divine relationship is they both acknowledge the uniqueness and value of each individual human self, and they also claim that no individual human's I-ness, the core of their personhood, is strictly bounded or self-subsisting. Instead, they claim that the spiritual path, if followed with sincerity and commitment, will reveal to you that what seems to be your independent, subsisting identity is entirely dependent on and ultimately grounded in God as the one who's continuously renewing your personal existence as a moment-to-moment endowment. Now, obviously, this is a claim about meditative experience, so it could only be verified personally. Right? So the Akbari's qualified non-dualism envisions a spiritual path in which one is seeking to return to the ground of one's being through meditative remembrance, the first major phase of which culminates in unitive experience. What is unitive experience? In the study of religion, unitive experience is defined as a state of consciousness characterized by a sense of oneness that transcends ordinary sensory and cognitive experiences, involves the dropping away of the sense of being a separate entity in a world of other separate entities, and can include the feeling of union with God and the cosmos. For more information on this, I encourage you to read Jones and Gelman's entry on mysticism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, the Akbaris claim that this kind of unitive experience is followed by a return to relative separate existence as an individual agent, but one who's been fundamentally altered and recognizes his or her ground in God. So at that point, the human being's journey is not over. For the Akbaris, they say that one continues to undergo refinements through the experience of unity and multiplicity. Right? So there's both selfhood and transparency to an all-encompassing divine oneness. And for this reason, Ibn al-Arabi will say that actualizing your relationship with God will show you that, in Ibn Arabi's words, you are he, not he. Huwa la huwa. You are he, not he. And if you want to read more about a phenomenological perspective on Ibn Arabi, I'll link to some scholarly publications of mine in the notes. So now that I've sketched these views, I'm going to consider some psychological consequences of holding a dualist versus a qualified non-dual view. I'm going to dramatize the positions in order to emphasize the differences, understanding that figures that Adnan and I are going to be talking about, like Al-Ghazali and Tlemceni, are on a continuum. They're not opposites. So, dualism. If you have a strong dualistic view, you'd envision yourself as strictly and necessarily separate from God. In this view, God or the divine is something other than what we are, entirely, utterly exalted, utterly different, absolutely beyond anything in creation and beyond you yourself. This is a perspective that emphasizes God's incomparability, tanzi in Arabic. So likely in this view, God would be envisioned as a remote, unknowable authority, majestic, overwhelming, beyond relation. This perspective can inspire awe, humility, and a deep recognition of the limits of human capacity and knowledge. It can also lead to assuming that there's an unbridgeable distance between oneself and the divine. One might see oneself as merely the unworthy subject of an infinite, impersonal king from whom one can't expect intimacy or reciprocity, because any relationship would imply a kind of felt continuity with God. It might seem that the only acceptable posture is obedience without questioning, reverence but without intimacy, submission but without closeness. Why? Why these consequences? Well, by way of analogy, imagine you're in a relationship with someone who you can only obey, but you're never permitted to question. Someone who you're expected to revere, but with whom you can never expect intimacy. That gives you the flavor of the way the relationship might be interpreted. So any report of spiritual experience that suggests nearness, intimacy, or connection with God, what Sufis refer to with words like qurba, proximity, or uns, intimate companionship, would likely be viewed with suspicion, even considered heretical, because it would appear to contradict the strict transcendence of the divine. So in contrast, now, a qualified non-dual view implies a more dynamic boundaries between humans and God that allow for and actually require relationship. The word qualified in qualified non-dual means that God's oneness and transcendence is affirmed, the tanzi aspect in Islamic theology and mysticism that I mentioned. But so is God's immanence in creation and in ourselves, the tashbih aspect, meaning the ways in which the divine is immanent within creation and ourselves. And therefore, those with a qualified non-dual view will claim that the potentiality, and even more so, the drive for intimacy and relationship, is built into the fabric of the cosmos by God, because creation is the occasion for him to continually come to know himself through us. The prophetic expression that Adnan and I mentioned, who knows himself knows his Lord, implies that the human is already intrinsically connected to God, and in a profound sense, a partial reflection of the divine. So there's not only awe in relation to God's transcendence and majesty, but also the possibility for love and intimacy. And that isn't to be found through a one-sided negating of oneself, but instead by knowing oneself deeply so as to know one's divine source. And it's in this context that expressions like one mentioned by Ibn Arabi, neither my heaven nor my earth can contain me, but the heart of my servant with iman, with faith, can contain me. This is acceptable for a qualified non-dualist, but would likely be dismissed, and indeed has been rejected as heretical from a dualist perspective. Why? Well, it might be rejected because it implies too intimate an interrelationship between God and human. And since I'm on this theme, I'll share an excerpt from Tlemceni's book on the names that might shock some of you. I'll remind you that Afif al-Din Tlemceni was a 13th century Sufi. He studied with Ibn Arabi, and he was a close companion and student of Sadruddin Kunawi. And his book on the divine names is guiding my commentary in the series with Adnan. So, in Tlemceni's chapter commenting on the name the friend, al-Wali, Tlemceni is discussing the unitive divine essence, or zat, which, like Ibn Arabi, he says is ungraspable by intellectual reflection. And referencing the unitive experiences of the mystics, he says, people who don't grasp their underlying oneness with God experientially will reject what he's saying because they mistakenly view the human servant and the Lord to be truly completely different and disconnected, instead of profoundly interrelated aspects of God's all-encompassing oneness. So, he writes, quote, they do not know that servanthood and lordship are both names of exaltedness, and that neither is above the other. For in view of the oneness of the divine essence, the one who occupies one rank is precisely the one who occupies the other. And since opposing properties belong to, are in, and through the one, how could some properties be more eminent than others? Unquote. So this is a radical claim. Now, from the dualist perspective, the critique of people's tendency to egocentrism, selfishness, etc., is clear. You should humble yourself before God, restrain your selfishness, seek to cultivate better habits and attributes in imitation of God's own perfection. Not bad, right? This could yield a kind of conscientious, righteous pietism. I expect this is much of what we're going to hear from Adnan about al-Ghazali's work on the names. In contrast, from the qualified non-dual perspective, there's a kind of different critique of egocentrism. Yes, people must learn developmentally to restrain their egotism and cultivate good ethics. But this is because humans are viewed each as trustees of a unique combination of attributes that are divine endowments, attributes which at their depth are divine self-manifestations, tajalliyat, through the human locus that you are. So the more complete you become, the more you are properly clearing the way for his manifestation through you in this world of multiplicity. So for the Akbaris, the meditative practice of remembrance is not aimed at leading to a permanent dissolution of your sense of selfhood, but rather a series of impactful but transient spiritual states that transform the person's self-understanding even as they're challenged to integrate those understandings in their life in the world as a distinct individual person among others. And in fact, someone who's even more aware of their human fallibility than before. So I want to close with some lines from the 14th century poem of Mahmoud Shabistari, the poem The Garden of Mystery, translated by Robert Dahr. The poem, as Bob notes in his introduction, is deeply influenced by Shabistari's study of Ibn al-Arabi and also of al-Ghazali. From that breath, the two worlds came into existence. From that very breath appeared the soul of Adam. Discernment manifested in Adam through reason, so that he might come to know the source of all things. When he came to see himself as a separate individual, he reflected on the question, what am I? He made the long journey from the part to the all, and returned from there to view the world's existence. He now saw the world as a factitious manifestation, like one diffused through the many numbers. The material and spiritual worlds sprang from one breath, coming into and departing existence in that same breath. Yet, this isn't a situation of coming and going. When observed aright, going isn't other than coming. Things revert to their proper origin. The hidden and apparent become one thing. God Most High, the Ancient, made in one breath the beginning and conclusion of both worlds. So again, thanks for your attention. See you next time.